Hello everybody and welcome back to the channel. Today I wanted to talk about a subject that I've been thinking about for a while, but I've been really thinking about for the last couple of weeks in detail. And the idea is that I'm hoping that this video is going to appeal to people who have perhaps come to Black Powder or Napoleonics in general, particularly from 40k, or maybe Malifaux or those other character-heavy games, or perhaps people who are brought to the Napoleonic period by the romance of the different units and personalities that were contained within. Now, if we look at the Albion Triumphant and Clash of Eagles supplements, we can see that there are what are known in Games Workshop circles as special characters, or named heroes, I guess you could call them. And you can get these, add them to your battle roster, and they have their own stats and abilities. Perhaps the most obvious of these is L'Empereur himself. So if we look at page 84 in Albion Triumphant Volume 2, this is the second edition I'm looking at here. I don't know if that makes a difference. I say second edition, I mean second printing. We can see he's got a staff rating of 10, he's aggressive and decisive, he adds 3 attacks to any combat that he's in. This is obviously the Joaquin Phoenix Napoleon. And he's got a special rule, Le Petit Tendu, units that make a morale check while supporting a unit in combat that breaks can reroll their morale roll. So that's Napoleon's, what he brings to the table. And I think we've all got those special individuals in the Napoleon period that we all have a particular fondness for. So those of you who have followed the channel for a while will know my love of General Van Damme. And, other people like this, they've got some abilities, some rules that you can apply in-game. Now, it's all well and good to have special characters, but Black Powder's not really a game of heroes. It's not like Warhammer, where your general rides his dragon into the enemy unit and slaughters everyone. It's a game of units. Now, there are differentiated rules for some units in the game that one could consider to be elite. So, for argument's sake, the 95th Rifles, they are different from British Line, both in equipment and stats. And that's fair enough. But what I wanted to look at today are units that are not necessarily special in of themselves, but they have either an extra battle honour or they did something that's particularly interesting, and we can hang a special rule off of that. This one's going to be on infantry units. I do have one in the bag for cavalry units as well, but today we're just going to be focusing on infantry. And I will also be focusing on the major powers as well. So apologies for all those Westphalian fans out there. But if this video seems to be popular, then maybe I'll have a look at doing the smaller nations in a later one. Now, the plan here isn't to make super units that are going to be able to walk through entire enemy armies on their own. But it's just to add a little bit of flavour. Let's be honest, after you've painted your 800th French line infantryman, it can get a bit boring. So this is just an idea to add a little bit more interest to some of those units. And I thought we would start with the French, and we would look at 2 infantry units in particular. The first one being the 18th Regiment of the Line Infantry, also known as the Brave. Now, the 18th had a long and storied career in the Napoleonic Wars, fighting first at Jemappes in 1792, and they're fighting all the way through to 1815, although they didn't fight at Waterloo, but they did fight at most of the other major battles, particularly when they were up against the Russians. They fought at the Pyramids, not against the Russians, but they did fight against the Russians at Austerlitz. They also fought at Jena, they fought Eylau, Friedland, Heilsberg, Essling, Wagram. They also fought in the 1812 campaign, Smolensk, Borodino, and then in 1813, in the battles for Europe, they fought at Dresden, Leipzig, and Hanau as well. So they had a long storied history, but unfortunately they had a real propensity to get their eagles stolen, particularly by Cossacks. So now the reason that they had their eagles taken twice, I think it was, one at Heilsberg in 1807, and then once at Krasny in 1812. So the reason they had their eagles taken was because they fought basically to the last man. Not quite, but they would stand and fight when other units might have already fled, and that meant that their eagle was, there were less people around to run off with the eagle, shall we say. So therefore, I propose one of two special rules for these guys. I wouldn't do both, but I would have either an extra point of stamina, so give them stamina 4 if they're a medium-sized unit, or I would give them the steady special rule, and that means that they automatically pass their first break test. Now, these are in place to represent the fact that they're more likely to fight to the last man. I think I would prefer them to have stamina 4. That's probably down the route I would go. But the fighting to the last man, automatically passing your first break test, can be a good one as well. If you are playing the rules for capturing the colours that I have previously talked about in another video, so the idea behind that was that if your unit is destroyed in combat, so if its morale roll is a 4 or less after modifiers when in combat, then you roll a dice. On a 6, the flag, the eagle, or the colour gets taken by the enemy, and you add 1 to that if the enemy is cavalry. So that was the so you add 1 to that if the unit that's broken you is cavalry, so they are more likely to capture the eagle. Well, in this case, I would plus 1 to that roll if it's the 18th Line Infantry Regiment, because they, as I say, they had 2 taken. That's right. To lose 1 is unfortunate. To lose 2 is something else entirely. Just as an example of how hard fighting the brave were, at Wagram they lost 45 of their 54 officers. So that's a good 90% casualty rate there. But by balancing out the extra point of stamina with the fact they're more likely to get their eagle taken, I think that balances the unit out. If you're not using the eagle special rules, then they've just got the upside. But I mean, that's fine. It's not exactly a major one. So for the second French unit, now I am limiting these to just 2 units per nation, because this video will go on forever otherwise. And all the units have really got something that can distinguish them from the others. But I'm going to go for a second French unit here, and we're going to look at the 9th Regiment Léger, the Incomparable. Now, those of you who don't know, there is actually a book called Incomparable about this unit. It is a fantastic book. It is highly recommended. And as we approach the end of November, I will probably do a video on book recommendations, obviously with an eye to Christmas coming up, but Incomparable is almost certainly going to be on that list. Now, these guys were light infantry, but they thought very highly of themselves. They basically considered themselves to be as good as the Guard. And they actually operated alongside them quite a lot. They spent a lot of time in Spain, actually, but when they weren't in Spain, they spent a lot of time alongside the Guard. And even when they were in Spain, they helped out to seize the pass at Samosierra when the Polish Lancers of the Guard charged the Spanish artillery. So what I would recommend with these guys, I should also say as well, they had a huge number of battle honours. In 1793, their first one at Neerwinden, and then they fought at a lot of the secondary battles, shall we say. So they didn't fight at Austerlitz, but they did fight at Ulm, as an example. They did fight at Eylau and Friedland, but after that, as I say, they went to Spain. So they did fight in Essling and Wagram, but in 1811 they fought at Fuentes d'Onoro, Badajoz and Bernos, and Vitoria as well. So they did a fight at Lutzen and Bautzen, so they were back in Europe later. But they got all over the place. But my point here is, it's not necessarily their battle honours that we're looking at here. It's more their rivalry with the Imperial Guard. So what I'm going to recommend for these guys is they are a normal size battalion, unless you have a large one. But let's say they're a normal size one, so they've got their 6 attacks in hand-to-hand combat. If they have line of sight in any direction to an Imperial Guard unit, then they get an extra attack. So you could make it so they reroll fails to hit, but I think an extra attack is better because it shows the ferocity. So the point there is that you could have, for argument's sake, a unit of Guard Lancers, and as long as the 9th know that they're under the eyes of the Guard Lancers, they're going to fight even harder. And the balance here is that they are légers, so you are really going to want them skirmishing and shooting, but then they become one of your premier close combat units as well. So there's a bit of a toss-up there of, do you want this unit to do what its assigned role is, or do you want it to get stuck in and try and get the extra dice. Now, if you've got no Imperial Guard on the table, well, they just count as being a normal unit, so it doesn't really matter. But I just thought that was a nice bit of fun, and which French player doesn't want Imperial Guard in his army? Now, if I'd thought about this better, I would have swapped those 2 unit entries around and done the line second, because they were the ones who fought against the Ruskies. And next up, we're going to look at some Russian units. So the first one I want to look at is a line infantry unit. It is the Pernau Infantry Regiment. Now, this goes back to what we were saying earlier on about the Capture the Colour special rules. If the Brave, if the 18th Regiment of Line were infamous for losing their colour, the Pernau ones were quite famous for finding them. They actually captured 3 French colours in the Napoleonic Wars. Then, later at Borodino, they actually charged cavalry with a bayonet charge. So that could be introduced as their special rule, that they can charge cavalry, although I'm not really sure how that would work. You'd need to say, well, do the enemy cavalry countercharge? Does that make them form square? It would cause all sorts of chaos, so I'm not going to recommend that one. I am going to recommend that we go with the capturing the colours, that they count as cavalry to get that extra +1 to see if they capture the colour or not. Being Russians, they already have stamina 4, they already have tough fighter, so I'm just going to leave it at that. I'm going to suggest that they have double the chance of any other infantry regiment to capture an enemy's colour. They would later be transformed from a line regiment into a grenadier regiment. So you could also, if you're not playing with the Capture the Colours special rules, then I would recommend that you give them the Elite 5+ special rule, as you would have with any other combined grenadiers. So for the Russians, they don't tend to have... Actually, no, that's not true. They do have grenadier regiments, things like the Moscow Grenadiers. But, yeah, so you could use the rules for them, but they're still a line unit. In the army selection, there are limits on the grenadiers that you can have. You can't have grenadiers in with a line infantry brigade. So this could give you a reason to have what are effectively grenadiers in that line infantry brigade. But for me personally, I would give them the +1 to capture the enemy's colour. The second Russian regiment I'm going to look at is another light infantry regiment. This time it's the 17th Jaegers, who they fought in the war against Persia, and they were surrounded. There were around about 2 companies of them, and they were surrounded by 20,000 Persians. So they were around about 350 Jaegers plus another 150 troops from another battalion. So around about 500, and they were surrounded by 20,000 Persians, and they withstood all attacks for 2 weeks from these 20,000 Persians. So absolutely fair play to them. Now, one of the things that helped them was they had 2 infantry guns with them. So the first thing I would do is give them an infantry gun that they can have even if skirmishing. So that's something that's a little bit different, and it allows them to have just something that's a little bit funky. Because it's on the tabletop, you're unlikely to forget it. That's going to be one of the main problems with these, is because your line units look like every other line unit, you're probably going to forget which one is the special unit. Well, in this case, you've got a little cannon on the table, so that can tell you. At a later battle, the Jaegers actually defeated 24,000 Persians, although that was part of a full brigade. But I would say it's still pretty good going. So the rule I would give these guys is going to be something a little bit different. It's not just going to be a special rule out of the rule book like the others have been, or for a weird tacked-on rule that I've made up. But for this one, I'm going to suggest that they can never be at a negative for supports. Now, what I mean by that is, if their opponent is supported by, say, 2 units, then the 17th Jaegers also count as being supported by 2 units. Now, if they are actually supported by 2 units, then they don't get any extra bonus for that. But the point here is that they're used to being surrounded by humongous numbers of men, and they carry on fighting anyway. So the special rule I'm going to give to the 17th Jaeger is that they never count as having less supports than their opponents. Effectively meaning that the combat is going to go down to the number of kills. So now we are going forwards for the fatherland, and we are going to look at the 2 best infantry units of the Prussian army. Now, there are the Prussians are quite difficult to really find out stuff like this. They were far more into their collective efforts. But what I'm going to go with is I'm going to go with the 8th Guard Infantry Regiment and the 9th Life Infantry Regiment, because the Prussian Guard units were part of the line. It's a little bit weird, but in 1813, they then moved the units from the line into the Guard, which became then a separate thing, which meant that the 9th Life Infantry Regiment then became the 8th, because the 8th had become the 1st Guard Regiment of Foot. I hope that makes sense. So what I'm going to recommend is that both of those units have the Elite 4+ special rule. They are effectively pseudo-Guard. After 1813, they are actual Guard, but we're going to make them pseudo-Guard. They're going to get the Elite 4+ special rule. Now, you could give them +1 to their morale save. You could give them... I wouldn't suggest that you do both. I would say if you're going to give them the +1 to their morale saves, then you give them Elite 5+. So I think there's a bit of wiggle room there. You either give them +1 to their morale and Elite 5+, or you give them Elite 4+. I don't think either one is necessarily any better than the other, so I leave that one up to you guys to decide. But that for me is how I would go for the 9th and the 8th/8th and 8th of the Prussian Line Infantry Regiments. I'm also going a bit rogue here. I've not got any notes for this on me, but I've just thought there was a battalion of Prussian Landwehr that survived an absolute flensing from the French artillery at the Battle of Leipzig. I can't remember who they are, so you might have to do a bit of research for yourself on this, or I'm sure there are people who know who can put the answers down in the comments below. And for those guys, it'd be nice to have a militia unit that's a little bit, a little bit veteran, shall we say. And those guys, I would say, are immune to the morale test caused by artillery in closing fire. So that's not quite how it went down at Leipzig, but it's close enough. So if they are hit by artillery from closing fire, then that unit of Landwehr do not care. But I can't remember what that unit was. So someone's going to have a look or pop it down in the comments down below. So having gone from one German-speaking people to the Kaiserliches, the Austrians are next up. Now, they had 2 units that were considered the best of the Austrian line. That was the 1st and the 4th Infantry. The 1st, known as the Kaiser's Own, were mostly made up of Czechs from, the core of the Austrian Empire, and the 4th were made up of mostly Austrians. Now, they were both considered to be very, very tough units, and for that reason, I've survived 17, nearly 18 minutes into this video. I'm going to see if I can string it out to 18 minutes without giving one of the units Tough Fighter. Well, here it is. I'm going to give both of those units Tough Fighter. Now, being Austrians, they are going to be large units, so they're going to have 8 hand-to-hand combat attacks. So re-rolling one of them is quite a minor buff. The more dice you roll, the lower the impact of a re-roll actually is. So I don't feel too bad about giving them Tough Fighter. It's not as powerful as if they only had, for argument's sake, 4 dice, then that reroll would affect 25% of their attacks. If they've got 8 dice, then it only affects 12.5% of their attacks. So it's not too powerful, I don't think. That's where I go with the 2 Austrian line units there. But there was another one that I wanted to add. Now this this is going to be a little bit more of tongue-in-cheek, a little bit more of a fun unit. This one is the 51st Infantry Regiment, and these guys came from Transylvania. That's my Transylvanian impression there. And what I'd really like to do with these guys is there's a number of different ways that you can go. Now, it wasn't just the fact that they were from Transylvania. They were notable for their skills. The French called them the Infernal Legion. And remember, this is long before Bram Stoker wrote Dracula, so it's not even got that connotation to it in the public consciousness yet. But there's 2 special rules that you can choose between which you give. Though actually, there's 3 that I would recommend. The first one, I think they should have either way, and that is that they should be able to skirmish light infantry if they are in terrain. Now, I know that all units can skirmish in terrain, but they don't get the light infantry bonus. I think the Austrians should do, and that's because Transylvania is very wooded, it's very hilly, so they should almost be like pseudo Grenza. Now I'm going to go with 2 more special rules. One of which is sensible, one of which is not. Now, the sensible one is in 1800, the 51st Infantry Regiment took part of the Battle of Marengo, and they helped to defeat the Imperial Guard there. So what I'm going to recommend for the sensible rule is that they have a -1 saving modifier to any Imperial Guard units they are fighting. So an Imperial Guard, say the Old Guard, they normally have a 3+ morale save. Against the 51st Infantry Regiment, then that drops to a 4+. And the second special rule, the second optional special rule I'm going to give is very silly, and it's going to be, the special rule is going to be called Vampiric Officers, because of course it is, and there's a whole number of different ways you can go with this. Now, this is clearly ridiculous, this is clearly a bit of fun, but I would only allow your opponent to use this special rule, or you should only use the special rule yourself, if you have modelled your commanders for this battalion as vampires. So there you go. I'll let you guys interpret that however you want. But you could say that they can mesmerise the enemy. That's one of the popular vampiric powers. So maybe they have 1 less attack in hand-to-hand. You could even roll off. If you score equal to or higher than your opponent, then they lose that number of attacks. That could be something that you do. So I guess you'd have to roll higher than them, wouldn't you? But you both roll the dice. If the French player rolls a 2 and you, the Austrian player, rolls a 5, then that unit loses 3 attacks. Although that would be pretty hardcore. Another thing you could do is, and this could be quite a cool one actually, is that if you fail a morale test, you can take an extra point of stamina. If you're already at your stamina, then this would count towards the negatives, and you can re-roll that morale save. Now, you can only do that once, but the idea there is that the vampire makes an example, shall we say, of some of the men around him. Or you could go with any other number of special. They could cause fear or anything like that. But as I say, that's very silly, and it's it could be seen as being a little disrespectful of the men who fought in the 51st Infantry Regiment. But no disrespect is intended, and if you want to have a bit of a light-hearted part of your game, especially after the success of things like the Silver Bayonet, then that's something that you could do with the 51st Infantry Regiment. So, having looked at all of the major powers, there is only one left to go, and that is the Army of His Majesty, the King of Great Britain, and the British Army. Now, there are 2... I mean, this is the army I know the best, and there are loads of different examples that I can think of, but I've picked out 2 here. The first one I've gone with are the 28th Gloucestershire Regiment. Now, I'll be honest with you, I don't know what unit they are now part of, but they used to have, back in 2000, they used to wear, their cap badge was the Sphinx, and that was due to their service in Egypt. But they also had a small cap badge that they would wear on the back of their berets, and that was because of the Battle of Alexandria. They fought back to back, so they famously were surrounded, and then they turned round. The front rank carried on fighting forwards, the rear rank fought backwards. So that's why they wore the 2 cap badges. So what I thought that could be quite cool there is it's a bit of a change of the core rules, but if they are flanked or rear attacked, then they don't suffer any minuses for that, and they only lose half of their attacks. So normally if you are attacked in the flank, you have to have half of your attacks go forward, which means they're wasted, and half of them can go to the side. So a normal battalion would waste 3 attacks and be able to fight with 3 and -1 to hit. Well, the Gloucesters only lose 1 attack to the front, and they don't have the -1 to hit from the side as well, which makes them a really good anchor unit. You could have them in the middle of the battlefield, and they would, look after themselves to an extent. They're still losing an attack, but, and they're still losing the morale bonus, the morale save modifier as well. But the to hit modifier and the number of attacks, they ignore the hit modifier, and they only lose 1 attack going forward. So that's my idea for the Gloucestershire Regiment. And the other one I've got is the 52nd Oxfordshire regiment of foot. Now, these guys also, well, I was going to say they also fought in the Orient. They didn't fight in Egypt. These guys fought at the siege of Seringapatam in India, and they would later fight, and they would be one of the storming battalions at the Battle of Badr Hoth. So I'm going to say with those guys, the siege of Badr Hoth, I should say. So I'm going to say with those guys, if they are assaulting an enemy that are in a building or in a built-up area, then the enemy only get +1 to their saving throw instead of the usual +2. You could turn it the other way around and say that they -1 from the saving throw of enemy units that are in buildings. So there you go. That's probably the easiest way of doing it, because that would then stack with pioneers and things like that as well. So because of their regimental tradition of fighting enemies that are behind cover and behind defended obstacles, then they have an extra -1 to the enemy save if they are in built-up areas. With all things equal, that should still give the enemy a bonus against them, but just not as big a bonus as it would be against any other regiment. So those are my ideas for some special units, in inverted commas, for the major powers of the Napoleonic Wars. Let me know if you think I've missed any out, if there's any that you would recommend. Let me know what you think of my suggestions. Are they any good? Have you got better suggestions? Have you got units that you prefer or that you know about and you think that there's some special rules that they could have as well? That was the infantry one. I'm going to do a cavalry one as well. I'm quite looking forward to the cavalry one, because who doesn't love cavalry? But I just want to say thank you so much for joining me, and I hope you've got some ideas. Even if you don't like these ones, I hope it gives you an idea of looking at modifying your own units and making them a little bit unique. Well, thank you very much for listening, and I shall see you guys next time.